Hey, glad you're here. Before we start tonight's creepy campfire story, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? I want to know who's still with me in the dark. Drop a comment, get comfy, and let the rain pull you into the story. You know, I used to love camping. Used to. Past tense, that is. There's something about sleeping under the stars, breathing in that crisp mountain air, hearing nothing but the gentle rustle of leaves and maybe the distant call of an owl. It's supposed to be peaceful, isn't it? Restorative. A break from all the noise and chaos of modern life. I'm telling you this because I need to get it out. It's been 3 months now, and I still wake up in cold sweats. My therapist says talking about it helps, but I haven't been able to tell anyone the whole story. Not properly. Not like this, with the rain coming down outside my window, creating that same steady rhythm I heard that night in Olympic National Park. Are you somewhere safe right now? Somewhere warm and dry? Good. Keep it that way. It was October last year. I'd booked a week off work. First proper holiday I'd taken in ages. My job in tech consulting had been absolutely mental, and I was burned out something fierce. My mate Sarah suggested I try solo camping. Reconnect with nature, she said. Find yourself. All that sort of thing. Olympic National Park in Washington seemed perfect. Remote enough to properly disconnect, but not so remote that I'd be completely out of my depth. I'd done my research. Of course. Picked a campsite called Mora, right near the coast. The photos online showed these incredible ancient forests, moss-covered trees that looked like something from a fairy tale. The kind of place where you'd expect to see hobbits. Not. Well, I'll get to that. The drive up from Seattle took longer than expected. Bloody Sat NAV kept losing signal, and by the time I reached the park entrance, it was already getting dark. October in the Pacific Northwest. The days are short, and when the sun goes down, it goes down fast. The ranger at the gate was this elderly chap with kind eyes and a weather-beaten face. He looked at my booking confirmation and frowned slightly. First time camping at Mora? He asked. First time camping anywhere on my own, actually. I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. He studied me for a moment. Weather's supposed to turn tonight. Rain's coming in heavy. You sure you wouldn't rather try one of the campgrounds closer to the visitor center? They've got better facilities, bit more populated. I laughed it off. I've come all this way for the authentic experience. A bit of rain won't hurt. Looking back, I wish I'd listened to him. But you know how it is when you're determined to prove something to yourself. I was going to be this rugged, independent person who could handle anything nature threw at me. The ranger shrugged and handed me a map. Site 14 is yours. Follow the coastal road for about 8 miles, then turn left at the sign. Can't miss it. He paused, looking like he wanted to say something else. Radio for help if you need it. We monitor Channel 16. By the time I found my campsite, it was properly dark. The headlights of my car cut through the blackness, illuminating towering trees that seemed to swallow the light. The silence was profound. That's the only word for it. I've lived in London most of my life, and even in the quietest moments, there's always some sort of background noise. Traffic in the distance, a neighbor's television, something. But here, nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing and the soft crunch of gravel under my tires. Site 14 was a small clearing surrounded by massive Sitka spruces and western hemlocks. The trees were so tall I couldn't see their tops, even with my torch. They created this natural cathedral around my little patch of ground. Beautiful in a way, but also oddly oppressive. like being watched by ancient giants. I brought one of those modern pop-up tents, dead easy to set up, or so the instructions claimed. Of course, trying to do it in the dark with a head torch was another matter entirely. Took me the better part of an hour, and by then I was sweating despite the cold. The temperature had dropped significantly once the sun went down, and I could smell moisture in the air. The ranger had been right about the rain. Just as I was securing the last guy rope, I heard it, the first drops hitting the canopy above. Within minutes, it had turned into a proper downpour. The sound was incredible, thousands of raindrops hitting leaves and branches, creating this natural percussion symphony. I actually smiled as I crawled into my tent. This was exactly what I'd wanted. Adventure, solitude, the raw power of nature. I heated up a tin of beans on my camping stove and ate them straight from the pot, feeling rather pleased with myself. Look at me, I thought. Proper outdoorsman. I even managed to get a small fire going despite the rain, though it took forever and produced more smoke than warmth. The rain continued to fall, steady and relentless. It was actually quite soothing, and I found myself relaxing for the first time in months. I sat by my struggling fire, sipping instant coffee from a metal cup, watching the flames dance and listening to the rhythm of the rain. This was what I needed. Peace, quiet, a chance to clear my head. Have you ever noticed how rain can make you feel both cozy and isolated at the same time? There I was, warm and dry in my little shelter, but completely cut off from the world. My phone had no signal. Hadn't had one since entering the park. The radio was there if I needed it, but somehow I didn't want to break the spell by testing it. I must have dozed off by the fire, because the next thing I knew, I was being woken by a sound that didn't belong. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the rain was still falling steadily. But underneath that natural white noise, there was something else. A rhythmic creaking, like old wood under stress. I sat up properly, listening hard. There was again, creak, 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 regular as clockwork, coming from somewhere in the darkness beyond my campsite. I grabbed my torch and shone in the direction of the sound, but the beam barely penetrated the wall of trees and rain. Probably just a branch, I muttered to myself. Old trees, wind, rain, of course things would be creaking. Nothing unusual about that, but the sound was so regular, so deliberate, like a rocking chair on a porch or a rope swinging from a tree. The thought of a rope made my stomach tighten for some reason. I told myself I was being ridiculous. I was in a national park, for God's sake. Perfectly safe. Thousands of people camped here every year without incident. I crawled into my tent and zipped it up, trying to ignore the creaking. It continued for maybe another hour before finally stopping. By then, I was properly tired, and despite the unfamiliar sounds of the forest around me, I managed to fall asleep to the steady patter of rain on my tent. I woke up around 3 in the morning. The rain had stopped, and the silence was almost overwhelming. You know that particular quality of silence you get after heavy rain? Everything muffled and still, like the world's been wrapped in cotton wool. But there was something else. A feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening. Nothing at first. Then, barely audible, the sound of footsteps on wet ground. Slow, deliberate steps circling my campsite. My heart started pounding, so hard I was sure whoever was out there could hear it. The logical part of my brain kicked in. Probably just a ranger doing night rounds. Or another camper who'd gotten lost and was looking for their site. Nothing sinister. I unzipped my tent flap slightly and peered out. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in silver light. The wet trees gleamed like metal, and puddles reflected the sky like scattered mirrors. It was actually quite beautiful, but I couldn't see anyone. The footsteps had stopped. "Hello?" I called out softly. "Is someone there?" No response, just that profound silence again. But now it felt different, expectant, like the forest was holding its breath. I was about to zip the tent back up when I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of my campsite, just beyond the reach of the moonlight, tall and perfectly still like a statue. Human shape, but somehow wrong. The proportions were off. Too tall, too thin, arms that hung just a bit too long. My mouth went dry. I blinked hard, convinced I was seeing things. Shadows playing tricks on my eyes. But when I looked again, it was still there, still watching. "Can I help you?" I managed to croak out, trying to sound braver than I felt. The figure didn't respond, didn't move, just stood there, and I had the horrible feeling that it was studying me, cataloging me, like a predator sizing up its prey. I reached for my torch with shaking hands, but when I flicked it on, the figure was gone, vanished. I swept the beam across the tree-line, but there was nothing there, just empty forest and the gentle drip of water from the branches. Just shadows, I whispered to myself. Just bloody shadows. But I knew what I'd seen, and more importantly, I knew what I'd felt. That presence, that sense of being watched by something that meant me harm. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat in my tent with my torch in one hand and the emergency radio in the other, listening to every sound the forest made, every drip of water, every rustle of leaves, every small animal scurrying through the underbrush. By the time dawn broke, I was exhausted and on edge, but nothing else had happened. No more figures, no more footsteps, just me and my overactive imagination. Or so I tried to convince myself. When the sun came up, everything looked normal again, almost laughably so. My campsite was exactly as I'd left it. No footprints in the mud around my tent. No signs that anyone had been there. I felt rather foolish, to be honest. Here I was, a grown man scared by shadows and forest sounds. Sarah would have had a right laugh if she could see me. I made breakfast, instant porridge and coffee, and tried to shake off the previous night's unease. It was a beautiful morning. The rain had washed everything clean, and the air smelled of pine and earth and growing things. Birds were singing in the trees, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the ocean. This was what I'd come for. This peace. This connection with nature. I wasn't going to let a bout of first night jitters ruin it. I spent the day exploring the area around my campsite. There were several hiking trails that wound through the forest, and I followed one that led to a rocky outcrop overlooking the Pacific. The view was spectacular. Endless gray ocean stretching to the horizon, waves crashing against the shore far below. I ate my lunch up there, feeling much more like my old self. On the way back, I noticed something I had missed on the way out. About 50 meters from my campsite, there was an old tree, a massive western red cedar that must have been centuries old. Its trunk was easily 3 meters across, and its bark was scarred and weathered. But what caught my attention were the markings carved into it. They weren't natural. Someone had taken a knife or some other sharp tool and carved symbols into the bark. Not words exactly, but definitely deliberate patterns. Spirals and angular shapes that hurt to look at somehow. They seemed almost awry to my peripheral vision, though when I looked directly at them, they were perfectly still. Below the symbols, carved in more conventional letters, was a single word, hunger. I stared at it for a long time, feeling that same unease from the night before creeping back. Who would carve something like that? And why here, in the middle of nowhere? The cuts in the bark looked old, years old, maybe decades, but the words seemed almost opposed with fresh meaning. I took several photos with my phone, though I'm not sure why. The camera struggled in the filtered forest light, and the images came out blurry and indistinct. When I looked at them later, the symbols seemed even more disturbing, like they were reaching out of the screen. The rest of the afternoon passed without incident. I gathered firewood, organized my kit, even managed to catch a few fish from a nearby stream. By evening, I was feeling much more confident. One night of paranoia didn't mean anything. I was going to enjoy my holiday. But as darkness fell, so did my mood. The forest around me seemed to press closer, the shadows deeper and more menacing. And when I lit my campfire, the light seemed pitiful against the vast darkness beyond. The rain started again around 8 o'clock. Not the gentle shower of the previous night, but a proper downpour that turned the ground around my campsite into mud. I retreated to my tent early, hoping to get a good night's sleep. That's when I heard the voice. It started as a whisper, so quiet I almost missed it under the sound of the rain. A single word, repeated over and over, "Hungry, hungry, hungry." I sat bolt upright in my sleeping bag, straining to listen. There was again, clearer now, definitely a human voice, though there was something wrong with it. It sounded hollow, empty, like it was coming from a great distance, or from underground. "Hungry, so hungry, please." My blood turned to ice. Someone was out there in the rain, and they sounded desperate. Lost, maybe, or injured. Every instinct told me to stay in my tent, but I couldn't ignore someone who needed help. I grabbed my torch and unzipped the tent flap. The rain hit me immediately, soaking through my jacket in seconds. I shone the light around my campsite, looking for the source of the voice. "Hello," I called out. "Where are you? Do you need help?" The voice stopped immediately. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the crying had been. I stood there in the rain, water dripping off my nose, waiting for a response that never came. Then I saw them. Eyes. Dozens of them, reflecting my torchlight from the darkness between the trees. They were too high off the ground to be animals, at least any animals I knew of, and they were arranged in pairs, like people standing in the forest watching me, but they were too far apart. The spacing was all wrong, as if whatever was looking at me had eyes much wider than they should be. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. "This isn't funny." One pair of eyes moved closer, then another. They were coming towards me, gliding between the trees with impossible silence. As they drew nearer, I began to make out shapes in the darkness. Tall, impossibly thin figures that seemed to bend and sway like branches in the wind. The hungry voice started again, but now I could tell it was coming from multiple sources. A chorus of hollow, desperate voices all crying the same thing. "Hungry, so hungry. Please feed us, please." I stumbled backwards, my torch beam wild and erratic. The figures kept coming, emerging from between the trees like living shadows. Up close, I could see they weren't quite human. Their limbs were too long, their bodies too narrow. Their faces, God, their faces were worst of all, stretched and distorted, with mouths that opened too wide and teeth that gleamed wetly in my torchlight. "Please," one of them whispered, reaching out with fingers that looked more like twigs. "So hungry. Been so long since someone came to feed us." I ran, dropped my torch and bolted for my car, not caring about the tent or my gear or anything else. Just had to get away from those things. Those hungry things that wore the shape of people but weren't people at all. I fumbled with my car keys, hands shaking so badly I could barely get them in the ignition. Behind me, I could hear them coming. Not running, they didn't need to run. Just walking with that same measured pace, knowing I had nowhere to go. The engine turned over on the third try, and I threw the car into reverse, not caring that I was probably destroying campsite. The headlights swung around as I backed up, illuminating the creatures for just a moment. There were more of them than I'd thought. Dozens, maybe, all standing among the trees, watching me leave with those horrible empty eyes. I drove through the night without stopping, not even to call the park rangers. What would I have told them? That I'd been chased away by monsters? They have thought I was mad. Hell, maybe I was mad. Maybe the isolation and stress had finally gotten to me, and I'd had some sort of breakdown. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I know I'm never going camping again. You're probably wondering why I'm telling you this now. Why I finally decided to share the whole story. Well, I've been thinking about that carved tree, about that word. Hunger. I've been doing some research, looking into the history of Olympic National Park. Turns out there have been disappearances over the years. Campers who went into the forest and never came out. The official reports always blame bears or getting lost or accidents. But the descriptions from a few witnesses who lived to tell about it, they all mention the same things. Tall figures in the trees, voices calling for food, eyes watching from the darkness. I think those things have been there for a very long time, waiting in the deep forest, sustained by... I don't want to think about what they're sustained by. And I think I was lucky, very lucky. Maybe they weren't hungry enough that night. Maybe they were just curious about the lone camper stupid enough to venture into their territory. Or maybe they're saving me for later. Because here's the thing that's been keeping me awake at night. Ever since I got back from Olympic, I've been having dreams. Dreams of tall figures standing in my garden, looking up at my bedroom window. Dreams of hollow voices whispering my name. And sometimes, when it's raining like it's tonight, I swear I can hear them calling to me. Come back, they whisper. Come back and feed us. We're so very hungry. I've moved twice since October, changed my phone number, even considered leaving the country. But you can't run from something that's already inside your head, can you? They marked me somehow, those things in the forest, made me part of their territory. And the worst part? Sometimes, late at night when the rain is falling, and I'm lying in bed listening to those voices in my dreams, sometimes I want to go back. There's a part of me that remembers how peaceful it was in those first few hours, how perfect the silence was before they started calling. Maybe that's how they get you in the end. Not by chasing you or hunting you, but by making you come to them willingly, by making you miss the very thing that tried to destroy you. So here's my advice. If you're listening to this and thinking about camping in Olympic National Park, don't. Find somewhere else for your outdoor adventures. Somewhere with proper facilities and plenty of other people around. Somewhere the trees aren't quite so old or the silence quite so deep. Because some hungers are older than human memory, and some forests hold secrets that are better left undisturbed. The rain's getting heavier now. I can hear it drumming against my windows, and for just a moment, I could swear I heard something else mixed in with it. A voice calling my name, inviting me back to the place where the hungry things wait. But I won't go. I can't, because I know that if I return to Olympic National Park, if I venture back into those ancient trees and set up my tent in that clearing again, I won't be coming home. And maybe that's exactly what they're counting on. I need to tell someone about what happened to me last summer at Olympic National Park. My therapist keeps saying I should talk about it. But how do you explain something that shouldn't exist? How do you make people believe you when you barely believe it yourself? It's raining outside as I'm telling you this. Proper Pacific Northwest rain. The kind that taps against the windows like skeletal fingers. The sound takes me right back to that night. And suddenly I'm 27 again, sitting in my tent, listening to something circling my campsite that definitely wasn't human. Are you somewhere warm right now? Somewhere with other people nearby? Good. Don't take that for granted. It started as a simple weekend getaway with my girlfriend Emma. We've been together for about 2 years, and things have been rocky lately. Work stress, money worries, the usual relationship strains. She suggested camping as a way to reconnect. Just the two of us away from all the distractions. Olympics seemed perfect. We'd both grown up in Seattle, but had never properly explored the park. Emma did most of the planning. She was always the organized one between us. Found us a backcountry campsite called Bogaccio, about a 3-hour hike from the nearest road. Properly remote, she said with that excited gleam in her eyes. Just us in the wilderness. Looking back, I should have been suspicious of how eager she was to get me alone out there. But at the time, I was just happy she was making an effort to save our relationship. We set off on a Friday afternoon in July. The weather forecast was good. No rain expected for weekend, which was practically miraculous for the Olympic Peninsula. The drive to the trailhead took longer than anticipated. Emma kept checking her phone, muttering about GPS signals, taking turns that didn't match the directions we printed out. Are you sure this is right? I asked as we bumped down an increasingly rough forest service road. Trust me, she said, but there was something tight in her voice. Something that didn't quite sound like Emma. I know exactly where we're going. The trailhead was nothing more than a small clearing with a wooden sign, so weathered you could barely read it. No other cars in sight, which struck me as odd for a July weekend. Usually, the popular camping spots in Olympic are packed during summer. Brilliant, Emma said, shouldering her pack. We'll have the whole place to ourselves. The hike started pleasant enough. The trail wound through old-growth forest, past moss-covered trees that must have been standing when Captain Cook first sailed these waters. Shafts of golden afternoon sunlight filtered through the canopy, and the air smelled of pine needles and earth. Emma seemed more relaxed than she'd been in months, chatting about everything and nothing as we walked. But about an hour in, things started feeling off. The trail became less distinct, often splitting into multiple paths with no clear indication of which way to go. Emma always seemed to know which fork to take, but when I asked how she was so confident, she just shrugged. Intuition, she said. The forest is calling to us. That wasn't like Emma at all. She was a software engineer, practical and logical. The most mystical thing she'd ever said was that she liked the smell of old books. But I chalked it up to holiday excitement and followed her deeper into the woods. We hiked for nearly 4 hours before reaching what Emma claimed was our campsite. It was nothing like the photos on the park website, just a small clearing beside a stagnant pond, surrounded by towering trees that blocked out most of the sky. The place felt wrong somehow, too quiet, too isolated, and there was a smell in the air, faint but unpleasant, like something rotting just out of sight. This is it, I asked, looking around the gloomy clearing. Perfect, isn't it? Emma was already unpacking her gear, moving with strange efficiency. So peaceful, so private. I wanted to suggest we find somewhere else, but Emma was already setting up camp with determined focus. And to be honest, I was knackered from the hike. The idea of tramping through the forest for another hour or two wasn't appealing. We got our tents up just as the sun was setting. Emma had insisted we bring separate tents. More space, she'd said, though we usually shared when camping. Another thing that should have raised red flags, but I was too tired to argue. Dinner was tinned soup heated over a camping stove, eaten mostly in silence. Emma kept staring off into the trees, as if she was listening for something. When I asked what was wrong, she just smiled that strange, tight smile and said everything was fine. "You seem different out here," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "More intense." "The forest changes you," she replied, still not looking at me. "Strips away all the pretense. Shows you who you really are underneath." As darkness fell, the temperature dropped sharply. July or not, the Olympic Mountains get cold at night. I suggested we share a tent for warmth, but Emma shook her head. "I need space to think," she said. "About us. About everything." So we said goodnight and retreated to our separate tents. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the forest. No traffic noise, no urban hum. Just a whisper of wind through the trees and the occasional call of a night bird. It should have been peaceful, but something about the silence felt expectant, watchful. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was being woken by voices. Quiet conversation coming from somewhere outside my tent. Emma's voice and someone else's. A man's voice, low and gravelly. I checked my watch, midnight. Who the hell would be wandering around the backcountry at this hour? And how had they found our isolated campsite? I unzipped my tent flap quietly and peered out. Emma was sitting by the cold remains of our campfire, talking to a figure I could barely make out in the darkness. He was tall and thin, wearing what looked like old hunting clothes. His face was hidden in shadow, but something about his posture made my skin crawl. "Been waiting so long," the man was saying. "So very long for the right one." "I know," Emma replied, and her voice sounded different. "Eager. Hungry. I brought him just like you asked." My blood went cold. Brought him? Brought me? What the bloody hell was going on? "He suspects nothing?" the man asked. "Nothing. He trusts me completely." Emma laughed, and it was a sound I'd never heard from her before. Cold and predatory. He'd follow me anywhere. I want to confront them, to demand answers, but something primal in my brain was screaming at me to stay hidden. This man, whoever he was, radiated danger, and Emma, this wasn't the woman I'd been dating for 2 years. This was someone else wearing her face. The conversation continued for maybe 10 more minutes, but I couldn't make out most of the words. They spoke in hushed tones, occasionally glancing toward my tent. When they finished, the man melted back into the forest like smoke, and Emma crawled into her own tent. I lay awake for the rest of the night, mind racing. What had I stumbled into? Was Emma in some kind of trouble? Was she being blackmailed or threatened? The alternative, that she was willingly involved in something sinister, was too horrible to contemplate. When morning came, Emma acted perfectly normal. Cheerful, even, she made breakfast and chatted about our plans for the day as if nothing had happened. "Sleep well?" she asked with an innocent smile. "Like a baby," I lied, studying her face for any sign of deception. But she looked exactly like the Emma I knew. Same green eyes, same freckles across her nose, same habit of tucking her hair behind her left ear when she was concentrating. We spent the morning exploring the area around our campsite. Emma led the way, following what she claimed were game trails, but looked more like paths that had been deliberately cleared. She seemed to know exactly where she was going, pointing out interesting landmarks, A lightning-struck tree, a circle of standing stones that she insisted were natural formations, a clearing where the grass grew in strange spiral patterns. How do you know about all this? I asked as we stood before yet another oddly shaped rock formation. I did my research, she said, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. Read up on the area before we came. By afternoon, we'd hiked several miles from our campsite, deeper into the wilderness than I'd ever been. The forest here felt ancient and untouched. The trees so massive they created a natural cathedral around us. But there was something unsettling about the place. No bird songs, no insect noise, just an oppressive silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. We should head back, I said, checking my watch. Don't want to be navigating these trails in the dark. Just a bit further, Emma insisted. There's something I want to show you. Against my better judgment, I followed her deeper into the woods. The trail, if it could be called a trail, wound between enormous tree trunks and overfallen logs covered in moss. The canopy above was so thick that even in mid-afternoon, the light was dim and green-tinged. Finally, Emma stopped in a small clearing dominated by a single, massive cedar tree. The trunk must have been 5 meters across, and carved into its bark were symbols I didn't recognize. Not Native American petroglyphs. These looked older somehow, more primitive. They seemed to shift and writhe when I wasn't looking directly at them. What is this place? I whispered. Sacred ground, Emma said, and her voice had that strange, hungry quality again. A place of power, of transformation. Transformation into what? Instead of answering, she walked to the base of the tree and placed her hands on the carved symbols. As she did, I swear I heard something, a low humming that seemed to come from the earth itself. Emma, what are you doing? She turned to face me, and for just a moment, her features seemed to shift and blur. Her eyes looked darker, her teeth sharper, but then she was normal Emma again, smiling that innocent smile. Nothing, love, just admiring the craftsmanship. Shall we head back? The hike back to camp felt longer than it should have. Every trail looked the same, and I began to suspect we were walking in circles. Emma claimed to know the way, but I noticed she kept consulting something in her pocket. Not a compass or a GPS, but what looked like a small carved bone. Where did you get that? I asked when I caught a glimpse of it. Get what? She quickly shoved it back in her pocket. That bone thing, the one you keep looking at. Don't know what you mean, she said, but there was something defensive in her tone. Maybe you're seeing things. Altitude sickness, perhaps? We were barely 1,000 feet above sea level, but I didn't argue. I was beginning to realize that arguing with Emma, or whoever this was pretending to be Emma, was pointless. We reached camp just as the sun was setting. Emma immediately began preparing dinner, humming tunelessly under her breath. I sat by the pond, trying to make sense of what was happening. The rational part of my mind insisted there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe Emma was having some kind of breakdown. Maybe the stress of our relationship problems had finally gotten to her. But the primitive, instinctual part of my brain, the part that kept our ancestors alive on the African savanna, was screaming that I was in danger, that I needed to run. Now, as if sensing my thoughts, Emma looked up from the camping stove and smiled. Penny for them? Just thinking about us. I said carefully, about our relationship. Oh, don't worry about that, she said, and there was something almost pitying in her voice. After tonight, all our problems will be sorted. After dinner, as darkness settled over the forest, Emma suggested we go for a night walk. The forest is so different after dark, she said. So much more alive. Every instinct told me to refuse, but I was curious. I needed to understand what was happening. Even if the knowledge might destroy me, we set off into the trees, following Emma's lead by the light of our head torches. She moved with confidence, as if she could see perfectly in the dark. The forest around us was utterly silent. No owls, no rustling of small animals, nothing. Just the sound of our footsteps on the soft earth and the steady drip of moisture from the branches above. After what felt like hours of walking, we emerged into the same clearing we'd visited that afternoon. The massive cedar tree loomed before us, its carved symbols seeming to glow faintly in the moonlight. But we weren't alone. The man from the previous night was there, standing beside the tree, up close. I could see him more clearly, and what I saw made my blood freeze. He was tall, nearly 7 feet, and impossibly thin. His clothes were indeed old hunting gear, but they looked like they hadn't been changed in decades. His face was gaunt and hollow-cheeked, with eyes that reflected our torchlight like an animal's. But worst of all was his mouth. When he smiled at our approach, I saw teeth that were too sharp, too numerous, like a shark's. "You brought him," the man said, and his voice was like wind through dry leaves. "Good. I was beginning to wonder if you'd lost your nerve." "Never," Emma replied, and when I looked at her, she was no longer bothering to hide what she'd become. Her face was sharp and predatory, her eyes black in the moonlight. "I've been planning this for months." "Planning what?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. The man stepped closer, and I caught his scent, something wild and rank, like an animal that hadn't bathed in years. "Your girlfriend has been feeding me information about you for quite some time. Your habits, your fears, your weaknesses. She's been such a good little recruit." "Recruit for what?" "The old ways," Emma said, circling behind me like a predator. "The hunger that came before civilization, before your kind forgot what they really were. I tried to run then, crashing through the underbrush toward where I thought our campsite might be. But the forest seemed to have shifted around us. Every direction led back to the clearing, back to the tree with its horrible symbols, back to the thing that wore Emma's face, and the creature that smiled with too many teeth. "There's nowhere to go," the man said gently. "This place exists outside your normal world now, outside time and space. You can't leave until we're finished with you." "What do you want?" I gasped, backing against a cedar tree. "To feed," he said simply. "It's been so long since we had fresh meat." "Oh." "We make do with the occasional hiker who wanders off the trail, but they're usually tough and stringy. You, on the other hand, you've been prepared, fattened up with comfort and civilization. You'll taste so much better." Emma laughed, and the sound echoed strangely in the clearing. "Did you really think I loved you? Did you honestly believe someone like me would want someone like you?" The words hurt more than they should have, given the circumstances. But even facing death, the human heart clings to its illusions. "How long?" I whispered. "From the beginning," she said. "From the very first time we met. I was hunting then, following the scent of loneliness and desperation. You made it so easy." The man began to change then, his already impossible frame stretching and contorting. His limbs grew longer, his fingers extending into claws. His face elongated into something that was part human, part wolf, part something else entirely. Something hungry. I pressed back against the tree, feeling the carved symbols rough against my back. As I did, something strange happened. The humming I'd heard earlier returned, louder now, vibrating through my bones. The symbols seemed to grow warm, then hot, The creature that had been pretending to be a man suddenly stopped its transformation and stepped back, confusion flickering across its distorted features. "What?" Emma began, but her words were cut off as the tree behind me began to glow. The symbols weren't just decorative, I realized. They were some kind of ward, a protection carved by people who had faced these creatures before and survived to tell about it. Light poured from the bark, washing over the clearing in waves. The thing that had been a man shrieked and stumbled backward, its form wavering like smoke. Emma cried out and covered her face, her disguise finally falling away completely. What stood before me now was something that had never been human, a twisted amalgamation of predator instincts and alien hunger, barely holding itself together in a recognizable shape. "Impossible," she hissed. "The old protections are gone. Forgotten. We made sure of that. But apparently, someone had remembered. Someone had carved these symbols and infused them with power that still held, even after all these years." The light grew brighter, and both creatures began to dissolve, their forms breaking apart like mist in sunlight. As they faded, their true voices emerged. Not human speech, but the howls and snarls of things that had never learned to speak, only to hunt. "This isn't over," Emma's voice whispered as she disappeared. "We know you now. We'll find you again." Then they were gone, and I was alone in the clearing with the ancient tree and its glowing symbols. I don't remember much about getting back to civilization. Somehow, I found my way out of the forest, though it took 2 days of walking, and I ended up miles from where I'd started. The rangers who found me said I was dehydrated and delirious, babbling about monsters and glowing trees. Emma's body was never found. Officially, she's listed as missing, presumed dead. Her family holds out hope that she's alive somewhere, suffering from amnesia or held captive. I let them think that. It's kinder than the truth. But I know she's still out there, along with her companion. Different faces now, different identities, but the same hungry souls underneath. And sometimes, on nights like this when the rain is falling and the darkness presses close, I think I can hear them calling my name. The symbols on that tree saved my life, but they also bound me to something I don't fully understand. I can feel them sometimes, warm against my back like a phantom embrace. And I know that whatever ancient power carved those protections into bark is still watching, still waiting. Because things like Emma and her companion aren't unique. They're part of something larger, something that's been hunting humans since we first learned to walk upright. Most of the time, they win. Their victims disappear without a trace, becoming nothing more than statistics in missing persons files. But sometimes, just sometimes, the old knowledge survives. The protections hold, and the hunters become the hunted. I've done my research since that night, spent months in libraries and archives, learning about things I wish I could forget. The symbols on that tree weren't unique. Similar markings have been found all over the world, carved by different cultures in different eras, but always serving the same purpose: to keep the hungry things at bay. Most of them have been forgotten now, dismissed as primitive superstition, but a few remain, hidden in places where the old ways still hold power. Places like that clearing in Olympic National Park, where the boundary between worlds grows thin and creatures from humanity's darkest nightmares still roam free. So here's my advice if you're planning a camping trip to Olympic or anywhere else remote and wild. Don't go alone. Don't trust strangers who claim to know the perfect spot. And if you see symbols carved into trees or rocks, pay attention to them. They might be the only thing standing between you, and something that sees you as nothing more than meat. The rain's stopping now, and I can hear the ordinary sounds of city returning. Traffic, sirens, the hum of electric lights. All the noise and chaos that drives us to seek solitude in the wilderness. But I'll never seek that solitude again, because I know now that we're never truly alone out there. Something is always watching from the shadows between the trees, something with too many teeth and an appetite that can never be satisfied. And sometimes it wears the face of someone you love. I'm recording this because I need someone to know what happened to me in Olympic National Park. Not the official version that's in the search and rescue reports, but the truth, the version that keeps me awake at night, that makes me check the locks on my doors twice before bed, that's slowly driving me mad with questions I can't answer. You can hear the rain, can't you? That steady drumming against the windows. It sounds just like it did that night when everything went wrong. When I lost 3 days of my life and came back different. Are you comfortable where you are right now? Surrounded by familiar things, familiar sounds? Hold on to that feeling. Because I'm about to tell you about a place where comfort doesn't exist, where time moves differently, and where some people go missing in ways that can't be explained by bear attacks or getting lost on the trails. It started as a solo photography expedition in September last year. I'd been planning it for months, a week-long backpacking trip through the most remote sections of Olympic's backcountry. I'm a freelance photographer, specialized in wilderness landscapes, and I'd heard about locations in the park that were absolutely pristine, untouched, the kind of places that make your career if you can capture them properly. My mate James thought I was mental for going alone. Olympic's not the Lake District, Kate, he said over pints the night before I left. People disappear in those mountains. Properly disappear. That's just stories to keep tourists out of the dangerous areas. I replied, though I'd heard the stories too. Hikers who'd left detailed itineraries and never returned. Search parties that found camps with everything intact except the people. Bodies discovered miles from where they should have been, with no memory of how they'd gotten there. But I was confident. I'd been hiking and camping since I was a child, knew how to read topographical maps, carried proper emergency equipment. What could go wrong? The drive from Seattle took most of the day. I'd planned to start my hike from the Sol Duc area, then work my way through the backcountry toward the whole river drainage. Remote country, but I had permits for all the designated camping areas and enough supplies for 8 days. The trailhead was nearly deserted when I arrived at 4:30 on a Tuesday afternoon. Just my car and one other vehicle, a battered pickup truck with Washington plates. As I was organizing my pack, an elderly man emerged from a forest. Park ranger, by the look of his uniform, though something about him seemed unofficial. Too old, maybe, or too weathered even for someone who spent his life outdoors. Heading into the backcountry? He asked, eyeing my camera equipment. 7-day photo expedition, I replied. Sol Duc de Haut River. He frowned. That's rough country. You sure you want to go alone? I've done plenty of solo trips. I know what I'm doing. I'm sure you do. He studied my face for a moment. Just, if you see anything unusual out there, anything that doesn't seem right, you radio for help immediately. Don't try to investigate on your own. What kind of unusual? But he was already walking away, disappearing back into the forest with speed that seemed impossible for someone his age. I called after him, but he didn't respond. Just melted into the trees, like he'd never been there at all. I should have taken that as a warning. Should have packed up my gear and driven home. But the light was perfect, that golden September afternoon light that photographers dream about, and I was eager to reach my first campsite before dark. The trail started easy enough. well-maintained path through old-growth forest, the kind of cathedral-like space that makes you understand why the Native Americans considered these places sacred. Massive trees that had been growing when London was just a collection of Roman settlements. Moss hanging like curtains between the branches, the air thick with the smell of cedar and earth and growing things. I stopped frequently to take photos, mesmerized by the way the light filtered through the canopy. My camera was capturing images that were already better than anything in my portfolio. This trip was going to make my reputation. I was sure of it. The first strange thing happened around mile marker 3. I was photographing a particularly impressive Douglas fir when I heard voices. Conversation, definitely human, coming from somewhere ahead on the trail. But when I rounded the next bend, there was no one there, just empty paths stretching into the forest. I called out, thinking maybe other hikers had stepped off the trail for a break. Hello? Anyone there? No response. But I could have sworn I heard laughter, faint and distant, like an echo of something that had happened long ago. By the time I reached my planned campsite, a designated spot beside a small creek about 6 miles from the trailhead, the sun was already setting. The place was perfect for photography. Crystal clear water reflecting the sky, surrounded by towering trees that created natural frames for my shots. I set up my tent quickly, wanting to catch the last light. The campsite felt oddly familiar, as if I had been there before, though I knew that was impossible. This was my first time in this section of the park. As darkness fell, I cooked a simple meal on my camping stove and reviewed the photos I'd taken. They were extraordinary, better than I'd dared hope, but there was something odd about them. In several shots, I could make out shapes in the background that I didn't remember seeing when I took the pictures. Human figures, partly obscured by trees and shadows. Other photographers, maybe, or hikers I hadn't noticed. But the more I studied the images, the more unsettled I became. The figures didn't look quite right. Their proportions were off, or they were standing in places that should have been impossible to reach. And in one photo, a landscape shot of the creek, there was definitely someone standing in the water, a woman in old-fashioned hiking clothes, staring directly at the camera with an expression I couldn't quite read. I checked my equipment, thinking maybe there was a problem with the camera, double exposures, or some kind of digital artifact. But everything seemed fine. The photos were clean, properly exposed, technically perfect except for those impossible figures. Sleep didn't come easily that night. The forest around my campsite was too quiet. No owl calls, no rustling of small animals, just an oppressive silence that seemed to press against my tent. And I kept hearing those voices, distant conversations that I could never quite make out. Around 3 a.m, I woke to the sound of footsteps circling my tent. Slow, deliberate steps on the soft earth. I lay perfectly still, listening, trying to determine how many people were out there. At least 3, maybe 4, walking in a careful pattern around my campsite. Hello, I whispered, not wanting to wake anyone if there were other campers. The footsteps stopped immediately. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sounds had been. I unzipped my tent flap slightly and peered out. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in silver light. I could see the creek, the surrounding trees, my camera equipment safely stored under the rainfly, but no people, no signs that anyone had been there. Yet as I watched, I saw movement at the edge of clearing, a figure standing among the trees, perfectly motionless, human-shaped but somehow wrong, like a photograph that had been slightly out of focus. I blinked and it was gone. The next morning, I found footprints in the soft earth around my tent. Barefoot prints, but oddly shaped. The toes were too long, the arch too high. They circled my campsite exactly as I'd heard the night before, but they didn't lead anywhere. They just stopped at the edge of the clearing, as if whoever had made them had simply vanished. I photographed the prints, though the images came out strangely blurred despite perfect lighting conditions. Something about those footprints didn't want to be recorded. That's when I noticed the first gap in my memory. According to my watch, it was nearly noon, but I clearly remembered waking up just after dawn. Where had the morning gone? I had no recollection of breaking camp, eating breakfast, or packing my gear. Yet my tent was already down, and my pack was ready for the trail. Confused and more than a little unnerved, I consulted my map and GPS. According to my planned itinerary, I should have been hiking toward Campsite 2 about 8 miles deeper into the backcountry, but I couldn't remember making that decision or preparing for the longer hike. I found myself on the trail anyway, walking through country I didn't recognize from my pre-trip research. The path was less maintained here, often disappearing entirely for stretches where I had to navigate by compass and instinct. But something was guiding me, some inner sense of direction that felt more reliable than my equipment. The photography was incredible. I was capturing images of landscapes that seemed untouched by human presence, pristine wilderness that belonged in National Geographic. But every photo contained those same mysterious figures. People who shouldn't have been there, standing in impossible places, watching me with expressions I couldn't interpret. And the time kept slipping away. I'd stopped to photograph a waterfall or an interesting rock formation, and when I next checked my watch, hours would have passed. Hours I couldn't account for, filled with activities I couldn't remember. By evening, I'd somehow reached a campsite that wasn't on any of my maps. A perfect clearing beside a pristine lake, surrounded by peaks that didn't match the topography I'd studied. The place felt ancient, untouched, like a secret that the mountains had been keeping for millennia. I set up camp automatically, my hands moving with practiced efficiency, even though my mind felt clouded and strange. As I worked, I began to hear voices again. Not distant this time, but close. Conversations happening all around me, as if the clearing was full of invisible people. Been waiting so long, finally found us. Time to remember? The voices weren't threatening. Exactly. They sounded welcoming. Familiar, even though I was certain I'd never heard them before. That night, I dreamed of walking through the forest with companions I couldn't see. We moved in single file along paths that glowed with their own light, heading towards some destination that felt both urgent and inevitable. In the dream, I understood everything. Why I was there, what was happening to me, what I was meant to become. But when I woke, the understanding was gone, leaving only fragments. Images of other people like me, photographers and hikers and researchers who'd come to Olympic alone and found something they weren't expecting. People who discovered that some places exist outside normal time and space, where the boundaries between past and present become meaningless. I woke that morning to find my camera full of photos I didn't remember taking. Night shots, mostly, illuminated by some light source I couldn't identify. They showed the lake, the surrounding peaks, and dozens of people standing in the water and along the shore. People in clothing from different eras, modern hiking gear mixed with outfits from the 1970s, the 1950s, even earlier. All of them looking directly at the camera with the same serene, knowing expression. And in the center of every photo was me, not taking the pictures, but standing with the others, part of their group. My face wore the same peaceful expression, as if I'd finally found where I belonged. I have no memory of those photos being taken. The next 3 days are completely gone from my memory, according to my camera's timestamp. I continued taking photos, hundreds of them, capturing landscapes and people that couldn't possibly exist. But I remember none of it. It's like those days happened to someone else. Someone who looked like me but wasn't me. The next thing I clearly recall was waking up in a hospital in Port Angeles. A search and rescue team had found me beside Highway 101, about 30 miles from where I'd entered the park. I was dehydrated and disoriented, with no memory of how I'd gotten there. The SAR coordinator, a kind woman named Janet, explained that I'd been missing for 6 days. My car had been found at the Sol Duc trailhead, with all my gear still locked inside. Search teams have been combing the backcountry for nearly a week. "You were lucky," she said. "Most people who go missing in Olympic are never found." "What about my equipment? My camera?" She frowned. "You didn't have any equipment when we found you, just the clothes you were wearing." But I knew that was wrong. I had vivid memories of taking photos, of carefully documenting everything I'd seen. The camera had been with me constantly. "Are you sure?" I had a professional camera kit, thousands of pounds worth of equipment. "I'm sorry, there was nothing like that. Maybe you cached it somewhere in the back country. People sometimes hide heavy gear to pick up later." They kept me in the hospital for observation overnight, then released me with instructions to follow up with my GP. The doctors found nothing physically wrong with me apart from mild dehydration and exhaustion. But something had changed. I could feel it in my bones, in the way familiar places no longer felt quite familiar. I returned to UK a week later, but I couldn't stop thinking about those missing days, about the photos I'd taken but could no longer find, about the voices and the figures and the sense of belonging to something larger than myself. That's when I started researching the disappearances in Olympic National Park. What I found made my blood run cold. Going back decades, there were reports of people vanishing from the backcountry. Most were solo travelers, photographers, researchers, experienced hikers. They'd disappear for days or weeks, then be found miles from where they'd gone missing, with no memory of the intervening time. But here's the thing that really terrified me. Many of the found individuals reported taking hundreds of photos during their missing time. Photos they could remember shooting, of places that didn't exist on any map. And in every case, the cameras and equipment were never recovered. It was as if something in the park was collecting photographers, drawing them into places that existed outside normal reality, documenting landscapes that shouldn't exist through human eyes and hands. I found online forums where other survivors shared their experiences. The stories were remarkably consistent. Memory gaps, impossible photographs, the sense of having participated in something beautiful and terrible that their conscious minds couldn't retain. One post from a woman who'd gone missing in Olympic in 1998 particularly caught my attention. I know it sounds mad, but I think they're building something, a record of places and times that exist outside our normal world. And they need our eyes, our cameras, our human perspective to make it complete. We're not victims. We're collaborators in something larger than we can understand. The rain's getting heavier now. I can hear it drumming against my windows with increasing intensity. And underneath that sound, if I listen carefully, I can hear something else. Voices calling my name. Familiar voices that speak with warmth and welcome, inviting me back to a place where time moves differently and reality bends to accommodate impossible things. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself looking at airline websites, checking flight prices to Seattle, calculating how long it would take to drive to Olympic. The pull is getting stronger. The need to return, to find those missing 3 days, to reclaim the memories that were taken from me, or perhaps to give them more memories to add to their collection. Because I'm starting to understand what really happened to me out there. I wasn't lost. I was found by something that exists in the spaces between our world and others. Something that needs human witnesses to make its reality complete. The photos are still out there, stored in cameras that exist outside normal space and time. Images of landscapes that shift and change when no one's looking, populated by people from different eras who've all made the same journey I made. And sometimes when the rain is falling and the night is quiet, I can almost see them. The photos I took during those missing days. They show a place of impossible beauty, where past and present exist simultaneously, where the boundaries between the real and the imagined dissolve completely. A place where lonely photographers go to become part of something eternal and beautiful and utterly mad. The voices are getting clearer now. I can make out individual words, spoken in tones of infinite patience and kindness. "Kate," they whisper, "it's time to come back. Time to finish what you started." And you know what terrifies me most? Part of me wants to go. Part of me remembers those missing days not as loss, but as the most complete and purposeful I've ever felt. Maybe that's how it works. Maybe the memory gaps aren't erasure, but protection. Our minds hiding the truth until we're ready to accept what we become part of. The rain's stopping now. Through my window, I can see stars emerging between the clouds. Clear skies for traveling. Perfect weather for photography. I've been putting off telling this story for nearly 8 months now. Every time I sit down to write it out or try to explain it to someone, my hands start shaking, and I can't seem to find the words. But it's eating away at me, you know? Like a splinter working its way deeper under your skin until you've got no choice but to dig it out, no matter how much it hurts. It's raining tonight. Proper Pacific Northwest rain that sounds like static on the roof. The same kind of rain that was falling when everything went wrong at Olympic National Park. When I learned that some jobs aren't worth any amount of money, and some places are better left alone after dark. Do you work nights? Have you ever had to stay somewhere alone when everyone else has gone home? Then you might understand what I'm about to tell you. The way shadows seem to move when they shouldn't. The way silence can feel like a living thing, pressing against your eardrums. The way your mind starts playing tricks on you in the small hours, when the barrier between the real world and the impossible gets paper thin. I was working as a security guard then. Not exactly my dream job, but it paid better than retail, and the hours meant I could attend university during the day. The company I worked for, Cascade Security Services, had contracts all over Washington state. Most of the time, I was stationed at office buildings or construction sites. Boring work, but safe, predictable. Then my supervisor, Dave, called me on a Thursday afternoon with what he called a special assignment. Olympic National Park, he said, sounding unusually excited. They need someone to watch over a research station for the weekend. Scientists are studying some kind of fungal growth in the whole rainforest. Good money, Marcus. Double your usual rate. Double rate was hard to turn down when you're living on student loans and instant noodles. But something in Dave's voice made me suspicious. He was trying too hard to sound casual. Why the premium pay? I asked. Remote location. Bit of a hike to get there. And you be completely on your own. No backup, no regular check-ins. Company policy says we have to pay extra for isolated assignments. I should have asked more questions. Should have wondered why they needed a security guard watch over a bunch of scientist equipment in a national park. But I was 22 and skint, and double pay sounded like a bloody fortune. I'll take it, I said. Dave seemed relieved. Brilliant. You'll need to drive up Friday afternoon. The research team will show you around, explain what needs watching. They'll head out Friday evening, and you'll have the place to yourself until Monday morning. He gave me directions to an access road I'd never heard of, deep in the Olympic Peninsula, the kind of place where your mobile loses signal, and the trees are so old they remember when the world was young. Friday afternoon, I loaded my car with enough supplies for a long weekend and set off for the mountains. The drive took longer than expected. The roads got progressively narrower and more rutted as I climbed into the hills. By the time I found the research station, the sun was already low in the sky, casting long shadows between the massive trees. The station itself was smaller than I'd expected, just a collection of prefabricated buildings clustered in a small clearing, connected by raised walkways to keep them off the forest floor. Solar panels glinted on the roofs, and I could hear the hum of generators somewhere in the background. Dr. Sarah Chun, the lead researcher, met me at what seemed to be the main building. She was a small, intense woman in her 40s, with prematurely gray hair and the kind of deep tan you get from working outdoors for years. "You must be Marcus," she said, shaking my hand. "Thank you for coming. I know it's a bit out of the way." "No problem. What exactly am I guarding against out here?" She hesitated, glancing back at the other buildings. "Vandalism, mostly. We've had some incidents. Equipment damaged. Samples contaminated. Could be local kids, could be anti-science activists. Hard to say." There was something she wasn't telling me, but I didn't press. Not my job to ask too many questions. Dr. Chin showed me around the facility. There were 3 main buildings: the lab where they process samples, a storage shed for equipment, and a small cabin with basic living quarters where I'd be staying. The whole place was surrounded by a forest so thick you couldn't see more than a few meters in any direction. The specimens we're studying are quite delicate, she explained as we walked between buildings. Temperature and humidity controlled environments. That's why it's so important to keep the generators running and the buildings secure. What kind of specimens? Fungal networks. Mycorrhizal connections between trees. We're mapping how they communicate, how they share resources. She paused at the door of the lab. It's fascinating work, really. These forests are like a single massive organism. The trees are just the visible parts. Something about the way she said it made my skin crawl, though I couldn't say why. The other researchers, 3 graduate students who looked barely older than me, finished packing their equipment as darkness fell. They seemed eager to leave, avoiding eye contact and speaking in hushed tones. When I tried to make conversation, they gave short, polite answers and quickly excused themselves. "We'll be back Monday morning," Dr. Chin said as they loaded the last of their personal gear into their cars. "The facility should run itself over the weekend. Just make sure nobody tampers with anything." She handed me a laminated sheet with emergency contact numbers and basic instructions for the generators and security systems. Radios in the cabin if you need to call for help. Channel 16 for park rangers. Channel 22 for our base station at the university. "What about mobile coverage?" "None. We're too deep in the forest. Radio's your only link to the outside world." As their cars disappeared down the access road, I was left alone with the hum of generators and the whisper of wind in the trees. The silence that followed was profound. No traffic, no city noise, just the natural sounds of the forest settling in for the night. I spent the first hour exploring the facility more thoroughly, familiarizing myself with the layout and the security systems. Motion sensors around the perimeter, cameras on each building, panic buttons in case of emergencies. Standard stuff, though better equipped than most of the sites I'd worked. The lab was the most interesting building. Rows of climate-controlled cases held soil samples and what looked like root systems suspended in nutrient solutions. Computer screens displayed complex network diagrams that reminded me of neural pathways or electrical circuits. Dr. Chin was right. It did look like they were mapping some kind of communication system. One display caught my attention. It showed a real-time readout of what was labeled as network activity, fluctuating lines and bars that pulsed in complex patterns, almost like a heartbeat or brain waves. The activity seemed to increase as I watched, the patterns becoming more rapid and intense. Probably just responding to temperature changes or something, I told myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was reacting to my presence somehow. Night fell probably around 8 o'clock, and with it came the rain. Not heavy at first, just a gentle patter on the metal roofs. But within an hour, it had developed into a proper downpour that drummed against the windows and turned the forest floor into a carpet of mud. I made myself comfortable in the cabin, which was surprisingly well appointed. Proper bed, small kitchen, even a television though it only picked up static. I heated up a tin meal and settled in with a book, planning to take regular patrol rounds throughout the night. The first sign that something was wrong came around midnight. I was doing my scheduled walk around when I noticed that the motion sensors weren't working properly. The control panel showed intermittent alerts, brief flashes that suggested something was moving around the perimeter, but when I checked the cameras, there was nothing there. Probably just branches in the wind, I muttered, making a note to mention it in my report. But the alerts kept coming, random blips that seemed to circle the facility, always just at the edge of the detection range. And the network activity display in the lab was going mad, patterns so complex and rapid they hurt to look at. By 2 in the morning, I was starting to feel properly unsettled. The rain had stopped, but the forest outside was anything but quiet. I could hear sound that didn't belong. Not the usual creaking of trees or rustling of small animals, but something else. Rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on wood. Soft scraping sounds, as if something was testing the walls of the buildings. I did another patrol, torch in hand, checking each building thoroughly. Everything seemed secure, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow seemed to hide something. Every sound seemed to carry a hint of intelligence behind it. That's when I noticed the first real sign of trouble. One of the lab windows had condensation on the inside, which was odd given the climate control systems. But it wasn't random moisture. It formed patterns, spirals and branching shapes that reminded me of the network diagrams on computer screens. As I watched, the patterns shifted and changed, like they were being drawn by an invisible finger, or like something was trying to communicate. I radioed the park rangers, more out of nervousness than any real emergency. Olympic Base, this is Research Station 7. I said into the handset, "Everything's secure, just checking in." Static crackled back at me for a moment before a voice answered. "Station 7, this is Olympic Base. Everything all right out there? Yeah, just the motion sensors are playing up a bit. Probably the weather." "Copy that. We've had reports of unusual animal activity in your area lately. Probably just the local wildlife adjusting to the research station. Nothing to worry about." "What kind of unusual activity?" The radio crackled again. "Sounds like you're breaking up." "Station 7. Did you say you needed assistance?" No assistance needed. Just curious about the animal activity." But the radio had gone dead. I tried a few more times to raise them, but got nothing but static. The next few hours were the longest of my life. The sounds outside grew more frequent and more deliberate, tapping that seemed to follow a rhythm, scraping that moved in purposeful patterns around the buildings. And the network activity display in the lab was completely mad now. Patterns so complex they seemed to pulse with their own light. Around 4 in the morning, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Footsteps on the walkway outside the cabin. Slow, deliberate footsteps that circled the building once, twice, 3 times before stopping directly outside the door. I grabbed my torch and the radio, heart hammering in my chest. "Who's there?" I called out. No response. But I could hear breathing, slow, deep breaths that seemed to come from multiple sources at once. I crept to the window and peered out. Nothing visible in the torchlight, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. And there was something else. A smell, sweet and organic, like rotting fruit mixed with fresh soil. The breathing continued for maybe 10 more minutes before gradually fading away. But I knew whatever was out there hadn't really left. It was just waiting. Dawn couldn't come fast enough. When the first gray light filtered through the trees, I finally felt safe enough to venture outside and check the perimeter properly. What I found made me question my sanity. The ground around the facility was covered in a network of thin, white threads. They looked like spider webs, but too regular, too purposeful. They connected the trees to each other and to the buildings, forming intricate patterns that hurt to look at directly. And they were moving, pulsing gently with the same rhythm I'd seen on the lab displays. I followed one of the threads to its source and found something that nearly made me sick. Growing from the base of one of the massive trees was what looked like a fruiting body, a bulbous, organic mass about the size of a football. But it wasn't just a mushroom. There were veins running through it, and what looked almost like primitive eyes scattered across its surface. As I watched, it pulsed once, and I felt an answering pulse from the network of threads. The whole forest was connected, I realized. One massive organism with the trees as its body, and the fungal networks as its nervous system. And the research station was right in the middle of it. I ran back to the lab, desperate to understand what I was dealing with. The computer screens were still active, showing network patterns that now made horrible sense. The researchers hadn't been studying fungal communication. They'd been studying something that was actively trying to communicate with them. One screen showed a real-time map of the thread network I'd seen outside. It extended for miles in every direction, connecting not just trees but animals, streams, even rock formations. The entire forest was alive in a way that human science was only beginning to understand, and it was learning from the research station. The patterns on the screens were becoming more complex, more purposeful. Whatever intelligence lived in the forest, it was using the researchers' own equipment to understand them. That's when I found Dr. Chen's real notes, hidden in a locked drawer. The truth was so much worse than I'd imagined. The vandalism, incidents weren't vandalism at all. They were the forest's attempts to communicate. Equipment hadn't been damaged. It had been modified, enhanced. The fungal networks had been integrating with the electronic systems, creating hybrid biotechnological interfaces. And the researchers had been working with it, willingly collaborating with something that saw human beings as just another resource to be absorbed into its network. The final entry in Dr. Chen's notes was dated just 2 days earlier. The integration is nearly complete. The network is ready to expand beyond the forest boundaries. We've identified several ideal candidates for first human nodes, isolated individuals who won't be missed immediately. The security guard will be perfect. Young, healthy, minimal social connections. By the time anyone realizes he's missing, the process will be irreversible. I was bait. The whole job was a setup to get someone isolated and vulnerable into the heart of the network. And I'd walked right into it. The sounds outside were starting again, even in daylight. More purposeful now, more urgent. I could see movement in my peripheral vision. Shapes that looked almost human, but moved wrong, like marionettes controlled by an unpracticed hand. I grabbed the radio and tried every channel, desperate to reach someone, anyone. Finally, on a frequency that shouldn't have worked, I got a response. "Hello." The voice was Dr. Chen's, but distorted. layered with harmonics that made it sound like multiple people speaking in unison. Marcus? Is that you? Dr. Chen? Where are you? I thought you'd left. I did leave, but I came back. We all came back. The network called us home. I could see her now, standing at the edge of the clearing. At least, I thought it was her. The shape was right, but she moved too smoothly, too purposefully. And her eyes reflected light like an animal's. You don't need to be afraid, she said, her voice coming from the radio and from the forest around me. The integration is beautiful. You'll understand once you join us. More shapes emerged from between the trees. The other researchers, but changed. Their skin had a grayish pallor, and I could see thread-like growth spreading across their faces and hands. They moved in perfect synchronization, like parts of a single organism. The network spans continents, Dr. Chen continued. We're just the latest edition, but we need more. Need fresh perspectives, fresh genetic material. I backed toward the access road, but they were already moving to cut me off. Not running. They didn't need to run. They knew I had nowhere to go. The process is quite painless, one of the graduate students said. His voice is layered and harmonious as Dr. Chen's. At first, you'll feel a slight tingling as the spores take hold, then a sense of connection, of belonging, finally transcendence. I could see the spores now, clouds of microscopic particles drifting through the air around them, beautiful in their own way like glowing snow. But I knew that breathing them in would be the end of everything I was. I ran, crashed through the underbrush toward where I'd parked my car, praying the keys were still in my pocket. Behind me, I could hear them following, but they weren't in any hurry. They knew the forest better than I did, knew every path, every hiding place. My car was where I'd left it, but the engine wouldn't turn over. The battery was dead, with a starter or something. I popped the hood and nearly screamed at what I found. The engine compartment was full of those white threads, wrapped around every component like a spider's web. The network had been working on my car all weekend, ensuring I couldn't leave. But I'm stubborn when I'm scared, and I managed to get the engine started by bridging some connections with my multi-tool. The car lurched to life just as the first of the converted researchers reached the clearing. I drove like a madman down that Forest Service road, branches scraping against the windows, the engine making sounds that suggested it wouldn't last much longer, but it held together long enough to get me to the main highway, to civilization, to safety. I never went back. Quit my job with Cascade Security the next day and moved back to London within the month. Told Dave and the authorities that I'd gotten spooked by wildlife and abandoned my post. Let them think I was a coward rather than try to explain what had really happened. But I've been watching the news from the Pacific Northwest, watching and waiting for signs that the network is expanding, because Dr. Chen was right about one thing. It does span continents, and it's always looking for new nodes to add to its collection. The rain's getting heavier now, drumming against my windows with increasing intensity, and I swear I can hear something else mixed in with it. A rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on wood. Soft scraping sounds, as if something is testing the walls of my building. I've been telling myself it's just the weather, just the old pipes in this London flat, just the wind in the trees outside. But there are no trees on this street. And the spores can travel a long way on the wind. Sometimes, late at night, I think I can feel them, tiny particles settling in my lungs, taking root in the warm, moist environment of my respiratory system. I tell myself it's just anxiety, just paranoia left over from that weekend in the forest. But my dreams are full of networks now. Vast, interconnected webs of consciousness that span the globe. And sometimes when I'm just waking up, I swear I can hear voices call my name. Familiar voices with an electronic undertone, speaking in perfect harmony. Marcus, they whisper, it's time to come home. The integration is nearly complete. You see, the network is ready to expand beyond the forest boundaries, and they've identified several ideal candidates for the next phase, isolated individuals who won't be missed immediately. People like you, listening to this story on a rainy night. People like me, trying to forget what can't be forgotten. The spores are patient. They can wait decades for the right conditions. And when they finally take hold, the process is quite painless. At first, you'll feel a slight tingling as they spread through your system. Then a sense of connection, of belonging to something vast and ancient and beautiful. Finally, transcendence. Welcome to the network. I've been sitting here for hours, listening to the rain against my windows, trying to work up the courage to tell this story. It's been 18 months since I inherited my grandfather's cabin in Olympic National Park, and I'm only now beginning to understand what he really left me. Not just a property, but a responsibility, a burden that's been passed down to my family for generations. You know that feeling when you inherit something from a relative you barely knew? That mixture of curiosity and obligation? That's how this all started. But what I found in those mountains, well, it's changed everything I thought I knew about my family, about myself. Do you have any family secrets? Old stories that the adults would stop telling when children walked into the room? Because every family has them, and sometimes they're exactly as terrible as you suspect. My grandfather, Thomas Hartwell, died in February last year. Heart attack. Sudden and peaceful according to the death certificate. I'd only met him a handful of times as a child. My father's relationship with him was complicated, full of old resentments and unspoken grievances. But for some reason, the old man left everything to me. His house in Sequim, his modest savings, and a remote cabin deep in the Olympic Mountains. Don't know why he'd leave you that bloody place. My father said when we were sorting through the legal paperwork, haven't been up there in 30 years. Probably fallen down by now. What's wrong with it? Dad got that look he always wore when family history came up. Guarded, uncomfortable. Nothing wrong with it. Just isolated. Not the sort of place for holidays. But I was curious. I just finished my PhD in anthropology, was between jobs, and the idea of a mountain retreat sounded rather appealing. Besides, there might be something valuable up there, something that would help with my student loans. The solicitor, Mr. Pemberton, seemed surprised when I expressed interest in actually visiting the cabin. He was an elderly gentleman who'd apparently handled my grandfather's affairs for decades. Your grandfather was quite specific about the conditions of inheritance, he said, shuffling through a stack of papers. The cabin comes with certain obligations, responsibilities that have been in your family for quite some time. What sort of responsibilities? He handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in my grandfather's careful script. He insisted you read this first, before making any decisions about the property. I opened the envelope right there in his office. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in my grandfather's handwriting. Michael, if you're reading this, then the duty is passed to you. The cabin isn't just a retreat. It's a watchtower. We are the guardians of something that must never be allowed to leave the mountains. Your great-great-grandfather built that cabin in 1887 for one purpose: to keep the sleepers from waking. Every generation of our family has maintained the vigil. Now it's your turn. Go to the cabin. Read the journals. Understand what you've inherited. Then decide if you're strong enough to carry on the tradition. If not, burn everything and walk away. But know that if you do, innocent people will die. Thomas Hartwell. I stared at the letter for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Mr. Pemberton, what the hell is this about? The old solicitor looked deeply uncomfortable. Your grandfather was eccentric in his later years, talked about old family obligations, ancient duties. I assumed it was just the isolation getting to him. And you have no idea what he's referring to? None whatsoever. Though I will say this. Your family has owned that land for over a century, and they've been remarkably diligent about maintaining it. Never missed a property tax payment. Never let it fall into disrepair. That suggests it meant something to them. I took the keys and the deed, but I almost didn't go. The letter was mad enough to make me wonder if dementia ran in the family. But curiosity got the better of me, and 3 weeks later, I was driving up a barely maintained logging road toward the coordinates Mr. Pemberton had provided. The cabin was much further into the wilderness than I'd expected. The road eventually petered out entirely, leaving me to hike the last 2 miles at a heavy pack. When I finally reached it, I was genuinely impressed. This wasn't some rundown hunting shack. It was a proper 2-story log building, solidly constructed and clearly well maintained. But the location was odd. Instead of being situated to take advantage of a view or water source, it was positioned on a small rise that overlooked a deep valley. The windows on the valley side were large and numerous, like it had been designed specifically for observation. Inside, the cabin was surprisingly modern. Solar panels provided electricity. There was a propane refrigerator, even satellite internet. My grandfather had clearly spent considerable money keeping the place updated. But what caught my attention immediately were the journals. Dozens of them, dating back over a century. Leather-bound volumes filled with careful observations, sketches, and what looked like guard schedules. The earliest were written by my great-great-grandfather, Jeremiah Hartwell, in a Victorian script so careful it was like calligraphy. I started with his first entry, dated September 15th, 1887. The cabin is complete, positioned according to the surveyor's specifications, with clear sight lines across the entire valley. The locals were reluctant to help with construction, claimed the area was cursed, haunted by spirits of the native peoples. But I have seen what lies beneath the earth here, and it has nothing to do with ghosts. It is older than human memory, and it must never be disturbed. The entries continued, describing a routine of careful observation. Jeremiah had apparently spent months at a time in the cabin, watching the valley below for signs of something. He never explicitly stated what he was guarding against, but his sketches were disturbing. Geometric patterns that hurt to look at, symbols that seemed to shift when viewed peripherally, and maps of the valley floor showing locations marked with warnings like "Do not approach" and "Sealed 1886." As I read through the decades of entries, a pattern emerged. Each generation of my family had inherited the duty, spending part of every year at the cabin, maintaining the vigil. They'd monitored seismic activity, temperature fluctuations, and something they referred to as convergence events. My grandfather's more recent entries were the most unsettling. The readings are getting worse. Electromagnetic anomalies increasing in frequency. The ground temperature in Sector 7 has risen 3 degrees in the past month. Something is stirring down there, and I fear I won't live long enough to contain it. Michael must be prepared. He's the last of the line. If he fails, there will be no one left to maintain the barriers. Barriers? I looked around the cabin with new eyes, noticing details I'd missed before. Strange symbols carved into the door frames. Mirrors positioned at specific angles throughout the rooms. And in the basement, something that made my blood run cold. The entire floor was covered in a mosaic made from thousands of pieces of metal, stone, and what looked like bone. The pattern was hypnotically complex, spiraling inward toward a central point where a heavy iron plate was bolted to the floor. Around the edges of the room, shelves held jars filled with substances I couldn't identify, and the walls were covered in the same protective symbols I'd seen upstairs. This wasn't just a cabin. It was some kind of containment facility. I spent my first week there reading every journal, trying to understand what my family had been guarding. The picture that emerged was fragmentary but terrifying. In 1886, Jeremiah had been part of a surveying expedition that had discovered something in the valley below, something that should have remained buried. His journal described finding artificial caverns beneath the mountain, structures that were clearly not natural but far older than any known civilization. Inside, they discovered artifacts and inscriptions that drove several members of the expedition mad. But worse than what they found were the things that found them. They are not dead, merely sleeping. The native peoples knew this. Their legends speak of the sleepers who wait, the old ones who ruled the earth before mankind existed. The surveying team awakened them partially, and 3 men died before we could reseal the chamber. But the awakening has begun. We cannot stop it entirely, only delay it. The barriers we constructed will hold for a time, but they must be maintained. The vigil must continue. The journals went on to describe a system of wards and barriers built throughout the valley, designed to keep something contained underground. My family had been the guardians of this system for over a century, maintaining the barriers and watching for signs that the containment was failing. And according to my grandfather's final entries, it was failing. I might have dismissed the whole thing as elaborate family madness, but that first night in the cabin, I heard them, the sound from beneath the earth. Low, rhythmic pulsing that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Not quite music, not quite language, but something that made my bones ache and my vision blur. I went outside with a torch, following the sound toward the valley floor. As I got closer, I could see lights moving beneath the ground, not electric lights, but something organic and phosphorescent. The earth itself seemed to pulse in rhythm with the sounds. That's when I understood that my grandfather's journals weren't fantasy. They were field reports. Something vast and ancient was stirring beneath Olympic National Park, and my family had been tasked with keeping it asleep. The next morning, I found the monitoring equipment hidden in the cabin's walls. Seismographs, electromagnetic sensors, temperature gauges, all connected to a computer system that had been recording data for decades. The readings were deeply unsettling. Whatever was down there was becoming more active, generating energy signatures that didn't match any known geological phenomena. But it was a schedule that really frightened me. Every journal contained detailed timetables for maintenance rounds, specific dates when family members would venture into the valley to check and reinforce the barriers. My grandfather's final entry indicated that the next maintenance was overdue by 3 months. The barriers were weakening, and I was the only one left to fix them. I spent days studying the maps and diagrams, trying to understand the system my ancestors had built. It was ingenious in its way, a network of constructed elements designed to channel and contain energies that shouldn't exist. But it required regular maintenance, specific rituals that had to be performed at designated points throughout the valley. The thought of going down there terrified me, but the alternative was worse. My grandfather's research suggested that if the containment failed completely, the consequences would extend far beyond the local area. These sleepers weren't just dangerous, they were existentially threatening. Their awakening would fundamentally alter reality in ways that human minds couldn't comprehend. So I prepared, studied the procedures, gathered the necessary materials, and on a rainy Tuesday morning in October, I descended into the valley to begin the maintenance cycle. The barriers were indeed failing. Ancient stone markers had cracked, metal components had corroded, and several of the key intersection points showed signs of serious instability. But worse than the physical deterioration was the sense of awareness I felt from below. Something down there knew I was working on the barriers. Something was watching me through the earth itself. It took me 3 days to complete the most critical repairs, working mostly at night when the electromagnetic interference was at its lowest. During the day, I'd retreat to the cabin and monitor the readings watching as my efforts gradually brought the containment back to acceptable levels. But I also began to understand why this duty had been passed down through the generations. The work was taking a toll on me, physically, mentally, and in ways I couldn't quite articulate. The symbols and rituals required for maintenance weren't just procedures. They were keys that opened doors in the human mind, doors that probably should have remained closed. By the time I'd finished the maintenance cycle, I could see things I couldn't see before, patterns in the landscape that revealed the true scope of what lay beneath, shadows that moved independently of their sources, and sometimes, in my peripheral vision, shapes that looked almost human but were composed of angles that hurt to perceive directly. I'd become part of the system now, connected to it in ways that the journals had never fully explained. The vigil wasn't just about maintaining physical barriers. It was about maintaining the boundary between realities, using human consciousness as a buffer against forces that existed outside normal space and time. And the worst part? I was good at it. The work felt natural, even necessary. Like I'd finally found my true calling. That's when I understood why my father had never wanted to talk about the family history. He'd known what inheritance awaited me, and he'd hoped that by keeping me ignorant, he could break the cycle. But some responsibilities can be avoided, only postponed. I've been maintaining the vigil for 18 months now. The readings are stable, the barriers are holding, and the sleepers below remain dormant. But I can feel them becoming aware of me, learning my patterns, testing the strength of my resolve. And I'm starting to understand things about our world that I wish I didn't know. The Olympic Mountains aren't unique. There are places like this all over the world, maintained by families like mine who've inherited duties they never asked for. We're a network of guardians, keeping watch over things that predate human civilization and would end it if given a chance. The rain's getting heavier now, and I can hear that familiar pulsing from beneath the earth. They're restless tonight, perhaps sensing that I'm sharing their secret. But that's all right. Someone else needs to know, in case something happens to me. Because here's the thing about inherited responsibilities. They don't end when you die. They just pass to the next generation. And I've been doing research into my family tree, mapping out the genealogy, trying to understand how the duty transfers when there are no direct descendants. Turns out I have a cousin in Manchester, Thomas Hartwell Jr., named after my grandfather. He's a teacher about my age, completely unaware of his family history. But the bloodline carries the obligation, whether he knows it or not. I've been writing him letters, trying to figure out how to explain what he might one day inherit. How do you tell someone that their family has been guarding cosmic horrors for over a century? How do you prepare them for the day they might receive a call about a remote cabin and a duty they never knew existed? Maybe you don't. Maybe you let them discover it the same way I did, gradually, reluctantly, with a slow realization that some burdens choose you rather than the other way around. The monitoring equipment is showing elevated activity tonight. Nothing critical, but enough to require attention. I'll need to make rounds in the morning, check the perimeter barriers, perform the small rituals that keep the large one stable. It's become routine now, this ancient duty, almost comforting in its predictability. And that's perhaps the most disturbing thing of all, how normal the impossible could become when you live with it long enough. Sometimes I wonder what would happen if I just walked away, sold the property, moved back to civilization, pretended none of this was real. But then I hear them stirring beneath the earth, feel the barriers straining against forces that dwarf human understanding, and I know I can't abandon my post. Because that's what we are, my family and others like us. Centuries on the border between the world as it is and the world as it could become if we fail in our duty. We're the reason most people can sleep peacefully at night, never knowing how thin the walls really are between reality and nightmare. The rain stopping now. Through my window, I can see the first hints of dawn over the valley. Time to check the morning readings, plan the day's maintenance, continue the vigil that my ancestors began over a century ago. And somewhere in Manchester, my cousin is probably just waking up, getting ready for another normal day of teaching, completely unaware that he might one day inherit the most important job in the world. A job that no one should have to do, but someone always must. The sleepers are patient, you see. They can wait centuries for their chance to wake. But they're always testing the barriers, always looking for weaknesses, always hoping that one day the vigil will end and they'll be free to reclaim the world they once ruled. That day won't come on my watch. And if I have anything to say about it, it won't come on my cousins either. Some inheritances are curses. Others are responsibilities. And sometimes they're the only thing standing between civilization and the dark. I need to tell you about what happened during the search for Rebecca Martinez. It's been haunting me for months now, and I can't shake the feeling that we didn't find her at all. That what came back with us wasn't the missing hiker we've been looking for, but something else entirely. Something that's been learning to be human, and getting better at it every day. The rain outside sounds just like it did that weekend in Olympic National Park. Steady, relentless. The kind of precipitation that soaks through your soul and makes you question everything you think you know about the world. It's the perfect soundtrack for what I'm about to tell you. Have you ever been part of a search and rescue operation? Ever spent days combing through wilderness, looking for someone who might already be dead? There's a particular kind of exhaustion that sets in, a combination of hope and dread that wears you down until you start seeing things that aren't there. Or at least, that's what I told myself at the time. I'm a paramedic with Olympic County Search and Rescue. Been doing it for nearly 15 years. We get calls all the time. Hikers who wandered off trail, climbers who've gotten into trouble, campers who've simply vanished. Most of the time, we find them alive and embarrassed. Sometimes we find them dead. And occasionally, we don't find them at all. Rebecca Martinez was reported missing on a Thursday in late November. 28 years old, experienced hiker, solo camping in the Quinault area. She'd registered for a 3-day backcountry permit, but failed to check out on schedule. Her car was found at Graves Creek trailhead with all her gear still locked inside, tent, sleeping bag, food, everything except what she'd need for a day hike. The call came through at 6 in the morning. I was already up, couldn't sleep properly anyway. Something about the weather had me on edge. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, turning the forest into a sodden maze where every stream became a torrent and every trail became a muddy track. We've got a missing hiker. Dispatch said, solo female, overdue by 24 hours. Can you mobilize a team? Within 2 hours, we had 8 volunteers assembled at the ranger station. All experienced searchers. Dave Kowalski, our team leader for over a decade. Sarah Chun, a local guide who knew the Quinault drainage better than anyone. Marcus Webb, a former Marine who specialized in wilderness tracking. And 5 others, including myself. The weather was making everything difficult. Visibility was down to maybe 50 meters in the heavy rain, and the forest floor was so saturated that tracking was nearly impossible. But we had to try. The first 48 hours are critical in any search operation. We divided into pairs and spread out along the most likely routes Rebecca might have taken. Sarah and I drew the Enchanted Valley Trail, a popular but challenging route that followed the Quinault River deep into the backcountry. Something feels wrong about this one, Sarah said as we started up the trail. She'd been doing SAR work even longer than me, had that sixth sense that comes from years of reading the wilderness. What do you mean? Can't put my finger on it. But experienced hikers don't just vanish like this, not with all their gear left behind. The trail was in terrible condition. Weeks of rain had washed out sections, and we had to pick our way carefully around fallen trees and washouts. But what struck me most was the silence. Even in heavy rain, the forest should have been alive with sound, dripping, flowing water, small animals moving through the underbrush. Instead, there was just a drumming of rain on leaves and an oppressive quiet that seemed to muffle our voices. We'd been hiking for about 2 hours when Sarah stopped suddenly. "Do you hear that?" I listened hard. Through the rain, I could just make out what sounded like someone calling for help. Faint and distant, but definitely human. "Rebecca?" Sarah shouted. "Rebecca Martinez?" The calling stopped immediately. We waited, listening, but heard nothing more. "Could have been an echo," I said, though I didn't believe it. We pressed on, following the sound toward a side drainage that wasn't marked on our maps. The vegetation grew thicker here, old-growth forest that blocked out most of the gray daylight. The calling resumed, always seeming to come from just ahead, just out of sight. "Rebecca, if you can hear us, stay where you are." Sarah called out, "We're search and rescue. We're coming to get you." The voice that answered made my skin crawl. It was definitely female, definitely distressed, but something about it wasn't quite right. The cadence was off, like someone reading from a script without understanding the words. "Help me," the voice called. "I'm hurt. Can't move." We followed the voice deeper into the forest, climbing over fallen logs and pushing through dense undergrowth. The terrain was becoming increasingly treacherous. Steep slopes slick with rain, hidden drops that could break an ankle or worse. That's when we found the first campsite. It was tucked into a small clearing beside a seasonal creek, partially hidden by the massive trunk of a fallen cedar. But it wasn't Rebecca's camp. The gear was wrong, old-fashioned equipment that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. Canvas tent instead of modern nylon. A cast iron cooking pot instead of lightweight camping gear. "That's odd," Sarah said, examining the setup. "Looks like someone's been camping here. But this gear is ancient." The strangest thing was how well-preserved everything looked, despite being exposed to weeks of Pacific Northwest rain. Nothing showed signs of water damage or decay. The tent was dry inside. The bedroll looked freshly made. "Help me," the voice called again, closer now. "Please, I'm just ahead." We left the mysterious campsite and continued following the voice. Within minutes, we found another camp, then another. Each one featured the same anachronistic gear, each one perfectly preserved despite the weather. "This doesn't make sense," I said. "It's like people have been camping here for decades, but all at the same time." Sarah was examining what looked like a journal left beside one of the campsites. The pages were covered in careful handwriting, but the ink seemed fresh despite the obvious age of the paper. "Listen to this," she said, reading aloud. "Day 3 of searching for the missing hiker. The voice keeps calling, always just ahead, always promising help. But when we reach the source, there's nothing there. I'm beginning to think we're not looking for a person at all, but for something that's learned to mimic human distress." My blood went cold. When was that written? Sarah flipped to the front of the journal. No date. But look at this. The author's name is David Kowalski, our team leader. But this journal looked decades old, and Dave had only been doing search and rescue for 15 years. "Help me." The voice called once more, and this time I could tell it was coming from directly ahead. Through the trees, I could see a figure sitting beside yet another campsite. Female, dark hair, wearing modern hiking clothes. "Rebecca?" Sarah called out. The figure looked up, and even from a distance, something about her face was wrong. Too symmetrical, too perfect, like a photograph of a person rather than an actual human being. "Thank God you found me," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the rain. "I've been trapped here for days. My ankle, I think it's broken." We approached cautiously. Up close, The woman looked exactly like the photo on Rebecca Martinez's missing person flyer. Same age, same build, same facial features. But her eyes were completely black. And when she smiled, I could see that her teeth were too sharp. "You're not Rebecca," Sarah said, backing away slowly. The thing wearing Rebecca's face tilted its head with predatory curiosity. "Of course I am. I'm the missing hiker you've been searching for. Isn't this what you wanted to find?" That's when I noticed the other campsites surrounding us. Dozens of them, each one occupied by figures that looked almost human but weren't quite right. Some wore modern gear, others clothing from different eras. All of them were watching us with those same black eyes. "We need to go," I whispered to Sarah. "Right now." But as we tried to back away, more figures emerged from the forest. Search and rescue volunteers wearing gear identical to ours. I recognized Dave, Marcus, even myself, perfect duplicates that move with uncanny synchronization. "You can't leave," the Rebecca thing said, standing up without any sign of the injured ankle she claimed. "You're part of the search now, part of the collection." The duplicate of Dave stepped forward, and when he spoke, it was with Dave's voice but without any of his personality behind it. "We've been searching for so long, looking for the missing, but every searcher becomes part of what's missing." I understood then what we'd stumbled into. This wasn't just a place where people got lost. It was a place that collected people, that trapped searchers in an endless cycle of looking for victims who didn't exist. And somehow, it was learning from each person it captured, building a library of human behavior and appearance. "The real Rebecca Martinez," I said. "What happened to her?" The thing wearing her face smiled that too sharp smile. "She's here. We're all here. Every searcher, every victim, every person who's ever gotten lost in these mountains. We become part of a collection, and a collection learns to be more human." Sarah grabbed my arm and pulled me toward what looked like a gap in the ring of watchers. We ran, crashing through the underbrush, ignoring the branches that tore at our clothes and the roots that threatened to trip us. Behind us, I could hear voices calling out, dozens of them, all using the same phrases we've been trained to use in search operations. "Stay where you are. We're coming to get you. Help is on the way." But they were all wrong somehow, like recordings played back without understanding. We ran for what felt like hours, always seeming to circle back toward the same area, always hearing those voices just behind us. The forest itself seemed to be working against our escape. Trails that led nowhere, clearings that repeated endlessly. Finally, we burst out onto a familiar section of the Enchanted Valley Trail. Real trail, with real markers and real mud from real rain. We didn't stop running until we reached the trailhead, where the rest of our search team was waiting. "Where the hell have you been?" Dave demanded. "You missed 3 radio checks." I looked at Sarah, and I could see the same confusion in her eyes. According to our watches, we'd been gone for less than 2 hours, but it felt like an entire day in that strange part of forest. "We found something," Sarah said carefully, "but not Rebecca Martinez." We debriefed with the team, but how do you explain what we'd experienced? How do you tell people that you've discovered a place where missing persons become something else entirely, where search and rescue operations become part of the trap? Dave organized a follow-up search of the area we described, but they found nothing. No campsites, no mysterious figures, just ordinary forest. The other team members looked at us like we'd suffered some kind of shared hallucination brought on by stress and bad weather. The official report stated that Rebecca Martinez was never found. Her case remains open, listed as a missing person presumed dead. But I know the truth. She's still out there, along with everyone else who's ever gotten lost in that part of Olympic National Park. And they're learning. 3 weeks after our search, I got a call from Dave. He'd been contacted by Rebecca Martinez. or someone claiming to be her. She'd turned up in Seattle, disoriented but alive, with no memory of what had happened during her missing days. She wants to thank the search team personally, Dave said. Especially you and Sarah, since you were the ones who found traces of her campsite. But we hadn't found any traces of her campsite. We'd found something else entirely. I met with the woman claiming to be Rebecca Martinez at a coffee shop in Seattle. She looked exactly right. Same height, same hair, same mannerisms as described by her family. But when she smiled, I caught a glimpse of teeth that were just slightly too sharp, and her eyes, while no longer completely black, had an odd reflective quality in certain light. "Thank you so much for not giving up on me," she said, and her voice was perfect now. No trace of the uncanny cadence I'd heard in the forest. "I don't remember much about being lost, but I know you and your partner saved my life." She was learning, getting better at being human with every interaction. I've been watching the missing person reports from Olympic National Park ever since. The pattern is always the same. Experienced hikers who vanish without a trace, then reappear weeks or months later with no memory of their missing time. They integrate back into society, resume their normal lives, but there's always something slightly off about them. Too perfect, too practiced, like they're following a script of how humans are supposed to behave. And the search and rescue calls keep coming. More missing hikers, more volunteers needed to comb the wilderness. I've stopped responding to calls in that area of the park, but I know other teams are still going out there, still getting collected. The rain's stopping now, and I can hear my phone buzzing with a text message. It's from Dave, asking if I'm available for a search tomorrow. Missing hiker in the Quinault drainage. Solo female experienced, overdue by 24 hours. The message includes a photo. Sarah Chun, our guide who knew the area better than anyone. Apparently, she went for a solo hike 3 days ago and hasn't returned. But that's impossible. I had lunch with Sarah yesterday. We talked about that strange search for Rebecca Martinez, about the things we'd seen in the forest. She seemed perfectly normal, perfectly human, except now that I think about it. She did seem a bit too eager to discuss the details of our experience. Asked very specific questions about what we encountered, like she was trying to understand something rather than remember it. And when she smiled, were her teeth always that sharp? I'm not going on tomorrow's search. I know what we'd find: more campsites, more figures wearing familiar faces, more voices calling for help that isn't really help at all. The collection is growing, learning, and it's starting to send its duplicates back into the world. How many of the people in your life are really who they appear to be? How many are just very good copies, getting better at mimicking human behavior with every passing day? The next time someone you know goes missing in the wilderness and comes back with gaps in their memory, look closely at their eyes. Listen carefully to their voice. Check if their smile is just a little too perfect, because the forest is always searching for new additions to its collection, and it's getting very, very good at making them fit in